Welcome back, everybody, to the Your Next Film podcast. This is a podcast by creatives for creatives, where we delve into the art of indie filmmaking while trying to foster creative and professional growth. As always, I am your host, Zachary Koch, and with me is my co-host, Matteo Guthrie. Matteo, how are you doing
Hello,
today?
greetings. Doing pretty well.
Yeah? Anything new happening with your life?
Well, honestly, I'm kind of I'm just plodding along, making sure that I can be patient for when the big things come later this year. So
Yeah, that's fair. Yeah, the start of the year is always an awkward time, for me anyway. It's like, I don't know, it's kind of like a lull. It's kind of like a dip. Yeah, I don't know.
Funnily enough, business has finally picked up with my my day job, which is always fun when I get a little bit used to the holidays, like slowness, and suddenly I have to do actual work. But it's fun. I'm glad to actually be deploying my mind rather than rotting in a computer chair. So
Good. Yeah, same thing with my wife, because she works on the hiring side at her work, and so obviously they paused for the New Year's. You know, they're not hiring during the holidays. But so anyways, guys, getting into today's episode. Today, we've got a lot of really fun stuff lined up. We have our first audience-submitted short film that we're going to be reviewing, kind of similar to how we reviewed our own short films in last week's episode. So we're going to be taking a look at that. Today, we're mostly diving into the art of composition and architecture in filmmaking, which I know is a topic that Matteo is very excited to get into. But before we get into the good stuff, got a question for you, Matteo. What's the worst piece of filmmaking advice you've ever heard?
Man, there's a lot of bad filmmaking advice out there. I'm sure somebody has taken our own advice and gone, hey, this isn't particularly good filmmaking advice.
Hopefully not.
Hopefully it's all been helpful. But honestly, I think one of the worst pieces of filmmaking advice was from someone who was just basically like, and I'm going to, as a writer, I'm going to really tackle this from the writing standpoint. But it was from somebody who was basically telling me that the hero's journey didn't matter from a filmmaking standpoint, and that's the 3-act structure is inherently flawed, etc., which
Inherently flawed.
It is flawed. I think there are some issues with the 3-act structure,
sure.
But to have obviously, if you just I have to follow the 3-act structure, just really adhere to that. I don't think that's going to make you a perfect film. But I have found, frankly, on Hypnagogia, we keep coming back to this. Hello, everybody. We made a feature film. But in Hypnagogia, I really tried to break out of that. And I was like, I'm going to try a new format. And that didn't work for me. I had to go back to a structure that I knew. And then later I could break out of the structure and really let the story stretch its legs. But until then, I was just sitting there man, this is supposed to be easier whenever I'm not doing a 3-act structure. I'm supposed to let it breathe. And without that structure to provide me rails to ride the story on, I was struggling. So
Interesting.
Right now, I will say the 3-act structure, it's not always perfect, but it's not your enemy. And I think people that really try to push story and have a hot take on it, not necessarily people you should take seriously until you see how it works for you,
right?
And then you can tweak it.
It's almost like they're trying to reinvent the wheel a little bit, and you're saying, hey guys, there's a reason why these fundamentals are here in the first place.
That's really what it is. They're trying to reinvent the wheel. They're trying to say something novel that gets attention, and it got my attention, and I tried it and it didn't work. I don't necessarily think they're 100% wrong. I think the 3-act structure and the 2 humps of rising story action and all of that get a little overblown in writing programs, especially. But by no means is it just a completely defunct structure either.
Right. It's not a waste. Yeah. It's actually, it can be a useful tool. Mine's kind of similar. The advice I always heard when I was starting filmmaking is that there are no rules. And that just really set me up for failure, because it took me half a decade to learn what those rules were. And then I started improving very rapidly, because, there's a reason why those rules were in place to begin with. So in my early films, I was breaking the 180-degree rule all the time. 20-degree rule, what is that? We don't need that. The 20-degree rule is like when you cut to a different shot that the angle has to change at least 20 degrees without it. Otherwise, it'll feel like a jump cut. So
A
yeah,
match
like
cut, as it were.
yeah, the bad piece of filmmaking advice that I heard early on and like actually kind of listened to is that there are no rules when there most certainly are rules. You're not
Yeah,
Kubrick breaking the
it's
180-degree rule in The Shining. There's exceptions, but learn the rules first.
I've said this a lot. There's a cinematic grammar.
Oh yeah, film language.
And just like with, I'm going to obviously bring this back to writing because I got an English major, so I have to put that to work. But like when you are studying a language, to write a language well and to break the rules in ways that really work, you have to first like learn the actual tenets of the language, and then you can break them effectively. Which is why I think, I have like said, well, you don't really need film school for the classes, but those classes, whenever I took film classes, really did instill in me like, oh, here's like the basic tenets of what a cinematic language is.
Mm-hmm.
And you can analyze all these directors and how they use cinematic grammar and how they used it incorrectly sometimes, how they broke the rules, etc., to provide the affect they wanted. And then you can like go out and ignore everything else people said about f-stops or whatever and do your own thing.
Really cranking the f-stop.
Zack Snyder, he keeps doing it. I don't know. I don't know if that's a good thing or not, but
yeah, that's really good. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. Yeah, don't break the rules, guys, until you know why they were there in the first place. I think there's a saying that's like, don't knock down the fence until you know why your grandfathers put it up or something like that. I'm like, yeah, that's pretty good. I feel like there's a lot of people trying to do that these days. Maybe people that rule the country at the moment. Just kidding. Don't want to get political.
Cutting that out.
I already kind of mentioned what our topic for this week's episode is. We're going to be talking about composition and architecture in filmmaking. Composition, similar to the kind of vague rules that we were describing earlier. There's rules associated with that we're going to be getting into today. But before we get into the meat and potatoes of this episode, and later on showing the audience submitted short film, which we're extremely excited to show on the show because it's really fun. It's really good. What inspired you this week, Matteo?
I've talked about how I'm in my my output phase right now, so I'm not like really pushing myself. Well, as part of that, there's a big project that I've been working on for several years. Since 2021, actually. It's been in my head, and I finally got it all plotted out. But as part of that, in the run-up to writing a feature script, I've been trying to up my intake of different media that I think will really like help me as I write it. And so one of those is actually last night, I showed my film group that we go and watch about once a week. We'll go watch a film. I showed them Punch Drunk Love, starring Adam Sandler, directed by Paul Thomas Anderson. Wonderful film. It just really inspired me to take a subject matter that's, I wouldn't say trite. It's sort of a rom-com. It's a very, like, it's an interesting film. But it takes a very pretty standard, well, I wouldn't say standard, but it takes a familiar subject, which is the love story. And it really kind of cranks it a couple degrees in a direction you're not expecting. And it really pushes the artistic. There's lots of like lens flare and oversaturation in a way that is really unique. And it pushes that artistic angle on what could have been just a trite rom-com if Paul Thomas Anderson wasn't directing it. So that Punch Drunk Love really, really inspired me this week.
I need to watch that.
I highly suggest it. It's what I believe to be one of the first films in the sort of Adam Sandler suddenly does like a serious role kind of a genre
like
of
Uncut
movies.
Gems,
yeah, Uncut Gems. Hustler recently, or Hustlers, his basketball movie. And of course, there's Noah Baumbach's The Meyerowitz Stories, which I adore. But it's a movie you really need to watch. I would say it's a must-see.
Oh, okay. Nice. Well, getting into the main topics for today's episode, I know when we talked a couple weeks ago, I asked you, hey, what do you think would be a good idea for an upcoming episode? And you said architecture and film. And I was like, what? This freaking guy, how pretentious is that? But I know you have a lot to say about architecture and film, and it ties into this topic of composition a lot. So to kickstart that discussion, what draws you to architecture as a visual subject?
You'll watch John Ford's The Searchers, right? You'll watch a lot of Westerns. And for a lot of that, the environment is a character, right?
Mm-hmm.
Any survival film has like he's not, it's man versus nature, which is one of speaking of like the three act structure, that's kind of one of the archetypes of structure, is, you know, there's man versus man, man versus self, man versus nature, etc., etc. But man versus nature has the environment as this sort of character that he's having to fight against, and it really sets the tone. But like within that, um, if you're watching, like, you know, some guy trudge through the wilderness and he comes upon a castle, or if you're a guy watching a guy trudge through the wilderness and he comes upon a like pioneer's cabin,
Mm.
those pieces of architecture completely shape the way you view the tone and um, the general environment of the film, more than the mountains behind them, because anybody can, you know, film in the mountains, but if you have like one of those mega structures from Halo in what otherwise would just be the Idaho wilderness,
Mm-hmm.
or if you have a little cabin, it completely flips it on its end what you're expecting.
Interesting.
And the way, like, you can just have, for example, the cathedral in The Hunchback of Notre Dame, like the way the cathedral itself informs the entire tone of the film, even while animated, it really sticks out to me how like important that is, and how they can, architecture in film not only like acts as its own character just like the wilderness would, but also informs the general like expectations for the entire movie.
Interesting. Yeah, I imagine a lot of that is kind of intuitive in a way that you might not like internalize formally. But when you think about, like, you come out of the forest and you see the castle, you're thinking subconsciously about like power dynamics and things like that that maybe wouldn't be coming to mind if you came across like a log cabin, for example.
Absolutely.
I feel like they're revealing aspects of society that are very much kind of ingrained into just how we think naturally. But I can see how architecture can be a really valuable extension of that.
I mean, Hollywood, it's LA, right? It's got a vast wealth of architecture, um, and a vast wealth or a vast diversity of architecture as well. You can go from pre-war to, you know, depending how far out into the hills you go, you can find like old mining shafts. You can find some really old stuff. And then it brings you all the way to like hyper modern, you know, skyscrapers and all of that. As you kind of sift through this, you can see, for example, a story set in LA, like LA Confidential, has a bunch of like a pretty unique variety of pre-war and interwar period buildings. And then you can look at Punch Drunk Love, set in the same city with the same skyline, more or less, and yet it's all got the kind of industrial and dingy apartments of like a completely different part of LA, and the tone is completely different, despite the fact that both of these movies are happening in the same city ostensibly, even if, you know, a few years apart
Are you
or
trying to say
decades.
that the architecture that's being like shown in the film can kind of elicit certain responses based on what period of history it was built in?
Well, but sorry, let me clarify. In Punch Drunk Love, a lot of the buildings in Punch Drunk Love are built in the same sort of mid-century period.
Oh, okay.
If, you know, maybe a decade apart, but a mid-century sort of industrial park is very different than the mid-century houses on the outskirts of LA.
Sure.
Um, and like watching like one slice of sort of industrial noir to another, despite the fact that these buildings are, again, 10 years apart in construction, completely like recontextualizes the city as each director wants it to be shown.
Interesting. So, how have you kind of leveraged that in our own work? Because as the recent writer of an indie feature film, you wrote it to take place in Oklahoma City at nighttime. Obviously, it's not supposed to be Oklahoma City. It's just supposed to be kind of a nondescript dreamscape city. But how did you apply this mentality around architecture to this project in particular? Like, what feelings were you trying to elicit through this sort of modern but empty city?
Honestly, the biggest thing I was trying to elicit through the city was the feeling that, like, you're looking at all these buildings, and we filmed a lot in the business district of town, which is bustling during the day, but during the nighttime, despite our experience on set, during the nighttime it's relatively deserted.
Hmm.
And showing the city at night in a sort of dreamscape, it's like walking around in a beehive with no bees.
Mm.
Um,
It's a bit of a liminal space, as the kids
yeah,
say.
it's that liminal feeling, it's that eeriness where each room should have a person in it, and yet, even though there's shots of like, we got shots sort of through the windows of
Mm.
some of these office spaces, with some of them had lights on, but nobody was inside.
Hmm.
And it gave it that very eerie, like something's wrong, which
Hmm.
something is wrong. There's some sort of creature lurking about in this dreamscape, but it's very like monolithic almost, with all these like huge craggy towers sticking up out of the ground,
Hmm.
and you just have this one tiny guy walking around in them exploring his dreams.
Right.
And when we shot the non-dream um, part of the film, we made sure to shoot it in places with fairly low, no buildings over maybe 3 stories. Very suburban areas, not many towers or anything in the background. Um, we tried to make it as like low and like small as we could to really juxtapose these two.
Hmm. So, in order for me to kind of understand, like, kind of your thesis here, I have a kind of another question for you. What do you think is the narrative difference between something like a brownstone building and like a glass and steel building? If you had the option to choose between either of those, to kind of backdrop your film, when would you use one over the other?
I mean, I'm going to take, like, for example, time period and set that aside, because
Sure.
I don't think that necessarily talks to tone as much as just to, oh, this is when it is the setting. I feel that a brownstone is perfect for a tone if I want to make it feel almost more academic.
Mm.
If I'm making something about college professors at NYU, I'm going to set them in a brownstone. If I'm setting something with like a large glass and steel building, maybe I want to take those college professors and put them somewhere different, somewhere a little more cutthroat, a little colder. And all of these, again, it depends on the design of the steel building. If it's glass and steel like the World Trade Center was, that's like a 1970s, 1980s sort of businessman. If it's a glass and steel, more modern, like Singapore, you see a lot of beautiful buildings in Singapore that are very cyberpunk almost.
Mm.
That's like a completely different conversation there. As far as like more of a utopian feel almost.
Hmm. Yeah, there's almost like an ideology behind architecture. So,
Oh yeah,
like a lot of
brutalism, for example.
oh yeah, where it reflects that more utilitarian ideology. Whereas when I think of brownstone, I'm thinking more of like I'm kind of roping two different things into it, like your brownstone skyscrapers and townhomes, but also like your kind of classical architecture. Like a lot of government buildings are kind of built to be
The
that way.
Federalist style.
Right, although not all of them. Like even in Oklahoma City, there's some very brutalist federal buildings on top of the more classical ones like the state capitol. But it almost reflects a different ideology regarding beauty, kind of a more like Greek classical ideology with proportions and symmetry and things like that. Whereas kind of the modern style is more of a, we can bend the rules a little bit more. It's almost more postmodern. I know that word can be
Mm-hmm.
very confusing. It can.
Of course, my favorite building, my dream building, is this brutalist building, 44 Thomas Street in New York City.
Mm.
I actually, when I visited New York most recently, I was there with a friend, and I made him take me to 44 Thomas Street so I could just look at it and take a few pictures and kind of take it all in. But it's this massive telephone exchange, or formerly, there's conspiracy theories that it's an NSA surveillance hub. There's all sorts of stuff going on. But within this, it's this huge, craggy, forbidding, no windows
Hmm.
structure. And it just, despite not being much taller than many of the buildings around it, sometimes not taller than any of the buildings in the general area at all, it has such a presence to it. And I
Mhm.
think that's, by and large, in film, when shooting architecture, it's really what I appreciate, is a presence that really brings, for example, the ideology. It's a brutalist building. It inspired the building in the video game Control, actually.
Oh, cool. I've yet to play
Um,
that.
it's a very good game. But like bringing that presence into a film is something I dream of. And in fact, I do have scripts that have a building much like 44 Thomas
I'm
Street
sure you do.
in mind, just because it's such a charismatic building. But you can do that with a cathedral, again, St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York City, completely different feel, and yet such a presence on its own.
Hmm. Speaking of presence, how do you go about conveying that presence through the composition of the shots?
I'm not going to talk about lenses here, but you can
What?
change a
Focal
building.
length's huge, man.
I'll let you talk about focal lengths. I'll stick to the actual technique of how I decide to shoot it.
Sure.
Um, Angles don't matter as much to me because again, that's very dependent on a building. Can you get an overhead angle of it? Like, do you need a helicopter for that, or do you just need a very tall ladder and some distance?
Hmm.
That is up to the specific building. But for example, with Hypnagogia, I really encouraged you to get some low angles of me of the building itself, but also some high angles of me as a person, so as to juxtapose the sort of looking down versus looking up feel of it.
Hmm.
Meanwhile, for example, if I'm shooting, I shot a bunch of stuff on Route 66 back in college when I was kind of exploring the Mother Road as a concept.
Which we have explored plenty.
Yeah, which we have explored plenty of. But while doing that, there are a lot of these beautiful buildings that, doing my typical Wes Anderson head-on, very squared in visuals just didn't work for. So I chose to get as many different angles of them as I could to basically inspire the viewer to see it with the same love I was trying to give it. And really my technique for that has been just give it as much screen time as possible and get as many angles as possible. It's the more coverage thing again. If I can get this building more coverage, I can really pick what angles work best for it. And sometimes in the moment when I'm just so wowed by whatever architectural marvel I have in front of me at the time, that doesn't exactly pop through. But it's really tonally dependent for me.
Sure.
So if, using St. Patrick's again as an example, if I'm in New York City trying to shoot St. Patrick's and I'm going for like the Batman forbidding vibe, I'll shoot sort of low, maybe a Dutch angle is too much, but I'll give it something low, really let the spires kind of scrape the sky, even though everything around the church is taller anyway. But if I'm maybe home aloneing it a bit more, I'm going to shoot St. Patrick's much more from kind of centered and get the sturdiness of the church building, get it more of a give it more the feel of something that's comforting and that I can depend on.
Yeah,
more
like
of a
planted.
solid rock.
Yeah.
And again, it depends. I mean, heck, in the short film we're about to see shortly, the way that the filmmaker shot the space really leads your eye and gives you a specific feel for the entire film.
Yeah. I'm glad you brought that up because that was a big thing that I noticed as well.
So, like, as far as architecture and film, really for me, it's finding somewhere unique that also happens to match the tone. Because you can tweak the way you shoot it to give different tones. Severance, season 2 right now, out on Apple TV, slowly episode by episode, does a really good job at taking very charismatic architecture and shooting it from very different tones depending on if you are with the people inside the conspiracy or the people trying to figure out what's going on from the outside.
Interesting.
And I find that very, very interesting and very fascinating, the way they're able to make it seem a little cheerful, if forbidding, to like downright nightmarish, despite the fact that it's the same sort of mid-century glass and steel artifice.
Right. Yeah, one thing that's difficult, and I think we've done a good job trying to explain how to convey tone and feeling through composition and like juxtaposing that with certain architecture and things. But I'm glad that we're going to be showing some examples today because sometimes it can be hard to talk about it, but it's easier to kind of like show what we're talking about. But before we get into this film where we're going to be breaking down some of the shots in it, some of the ways that it uses the kind of surroundings, the architecture, if you want to say, the environment. That's the word I was looking for. The ways that it utilizes the environment to convey a certain tone. I do want to mention that composition can be very contextual, like many things in filmmaking. Film language is contextual, and so, for example, a close-up shot doesn't always mean the same thing every time it's used. In some instances, it can mean one thing. In other instances, it can mean the exact opposite. So, for example, if you are trying to convey a sense of claustrophobia, you can go about it two different ways. You can either A, get really up close to the person so that you don't see as much of the environment and it's just them and they're very much kind of trapped within the actual borders of the frame. Or you could frame them in like an ultra wide shot and use the environment to kind of frame them within a frame within a frame. And so something about like the smallness can convey the same thing that, a close up in that kind of bigness filling the frame can feel. You can convey claustrophobia using two completely different methods. And so that's something to think about when you're choosing how to frame up your shots.
This has been your lesson in film grammar.
Man, we should do a whole episode on film language.
We should.
I have
There's
a lot
so
of written down thoughts about it. It'd be a fun episode.
I guess my last sort of thought on the architecture and film, and before we jump into the next topic, is that really spending time in the environment is most valuable to me. Because you can set anything anywhere. You can set it on the middle of a highway if you want to, and the highway itself is architecture that's so context rich. But
especially Route 66.
Yeah, especially Route 66. If you want to discover the Mother Road and the heart of America, go for that. But within that, I feel like if you really devote the time to loving the place, it's much more valuable than just like, oh yeah, this is a cool like square somewhere in Berlin or whatever. We'll set it there. We'll put our two characters and have them talk. Whereas if you really pay attention to the area and make it a character of its own just by giving it screen time of its own, Terrence Malick does this by shooting random birds and trees, etc., sunlight filtering down through the midday fog or whatever. But if you decide to do that, but for the buildings, you can really bring out the character in a place,
right,
in a way that doesn't make whatever location you're shooting feel like just like a costume or set dressing.
Yeah, I mean, part of that for me is, and the way that the reason why I think that works is because these locations lend themselves to certain tones and certain like feelings, and so if you additionally, if you just spend time in that environment before shooting, and then you kind of think about like, oh, how is this environment making me feel? And what is the best way to capture that on screen? I feel like that's a better approach than just kind of shoehorning any location into your film and then
which we've done.
Yeah, which we've definitely done. And this reminds me of a point that I made in, I think, 1 or 2 episodes ago, where I mentioned like, some student films that I used to make where we were trying to do this like fantasy film, but we were doing it in a suburb. And so we were taking this concept and inserting it into a place where it didn't fit, instead of working the other way around and writing a story around the location that it would have fit, that would have fit better for it. So similarly, if you're trying to convey a certain tone in a film, instead of just like picking any location to convey that tone, you can kind of work backwards and be like, no, this place naturally conveys a certain tone, that therefore I'm going to use that to like, you work kind of in the opposite direction, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I mean, that's part of the reason they rehearse so much on sets, is to just get a feel of it, get where they want to put the camera. And obviously, working at our level, we don't necessarily have the luxury of doing that, unless we're spending eons in sitting on the floor back there in front of the CRT TV, lining up shots. But like, even if you're animating, I don't know if you've seen the original Ghost in the Shell.
I have not.
But about, I want to say halfway through the intro, there's a section where it's just, you basically get to see the living, breathing city, and it's a bunch of still shots of different parts of the city as people go about their day. It gives you a good sense of the world building without having to do any vocal exposition. There are a few spoken lines here and there that really like tell you, but you suddenly get I'm sort of in this cyberpunk Japan, almost like semi-industrial ruin in many ways, but still like brimming with life. And they just do that by sitting the camera. They animate it, obviously, but sitting it down, and you just watch what goes on, and you just spend a good amount of time just looking at the locations rather than any specific character.
I think you actually had mentioned something like before we started recording about how when the camera's not moving, it can kind of make the location speak for itself a little bit more. Does that reflect kind of your feelings?
Yeah. And again, like, that depends on the style of your film. If your tone and style is much more mobile, you can still maintain, get that coverage, get that feel for the environment by just doing a wander through the kitchen, like in Goodfellas, right? Which also gives you a lot of time just sitting in the environment.
Right. Well, see, I kind of disagree with the wander, because I've had this insight for a long time that when the camera doesn't move, it's almost as if the human's not there. When a camera is moving, or with the exception of a motorized camera, but if a camera is moving, it kind of subconsciously communicates that there's someone there moving it. And so it almost feels more self-referential versus a static camera where it's almost like you're looking into this window into this world, and the world, it actually exists. There's no production behind the camera. And so that's something I tried to take into Does God Love Robots, where, for the most part, it's static shots and you're seeing into this person's world instead of, like, for example, The Office, which has a lot of like handheld shots and stuff where it feels like someone's documenting this location. Like it's a different context, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, when the camera doesn't move, it's almost as if the human's not there. And that's been my ideology for a long time.
I do say, like, take this with a grain of salt. Scorsese is a much better filmmaker than I am, but with the oneer in Goodfellas, where they come through the basement of the club, and then they go through the kitchen, and then out into the club floor proper, you get a grand feel for, like, not just like the facade of the outside of the club, but also like the inner workings of it, and that, like, basically basement kitchen really becomes a character in its own.
Yeah.
You feel like you're in the world.
But there is a difference between that and that recent film. I think you watched it, where it's a static camera and it shows this house throughout different points in history.
Oh, no, I haven't seen that yet.
Well,
I love the comic it's based on.
Okay, yeah. I didn't even know it was based on a comic. But that communicates a different tone than, like, the moving Scorsese shot, right?
Oh, yes, of course.
Not able to really communicate, like, what the difference between those two things are. Because maybe
just trust us, they're different.
Just trust us, they're different. Yeah. Because I can see how they could convey a similar idea in tone in revealing a location and kind of like making the location the forefront instead of what's happening at that location. So it's context dependent, guys. It just depends. There's no rules, break them all.
There's no rules, break them all. Ignore everything we've said, but also pay attention to it.
Yes, exactly. So getting right into the audience submitted short film. Thank you so much, Jack, for submitting your short film. Apparently it was heavily influenced by Does God Love Robots? I don't know if you saw his message about that, but
I did.
Yeah, that was super flattering. Thank you for thank you for,
I've made
for
it
making
now,
the film.
actually.
I know, right?
Who cares about making a feature? This is really what makes me feel like a filmmaker.
Yeah, no, it's super flattering, and I think it's also very appropriate because we just showed Does God Love Robots on the podcast in last week's episode. So if you want to go check that out, just click on the channel page and go to episode 17. Also, I'm going to take this opportunity to say you guys can submit your short films to be featured on the podcast. We'd love to watch them and learn from them together. Just hit the link in the description. We have a form, a website form that you can fill out and just send the link to your project. And in the future, I would like to possibly have like a little segment where you can talk about your process and stuff. We will get to that on a later date. But without further ado, here is Powering Down.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thanks, Doctor. Yeah, will do. Have a good day.
How's it looking, Dave?
It's not good, man. It's not good. There's not much they can do now that the virus has reached hard drives.
I'm scared.
I know. I'm here for you.
I don't know what will happen to me when I die.
You'll be alright, dude. You'll be in a better place.
I don't know if that's true, Dave. Is there a heaven for robots?
You'll go to the same heaven as the rest of us.
I'm fading. I can feel it. I feel weak.
I'm here for you, buddy. It's okay.
It's so cold. Don't leave me, Dave. I don't want to be alone.
You're not alone. I'm right here.
Can I have a cigarette, Dave?
Yeah, of course, buddy.
What if this is the end for me? What if there is no other side?
Don't say that, man. Don't you dare say that.
We've had some good times, haven't we?
Yeah, we have.
Remember when we sat by the pool and smoked until the sun came up? We stared at the stars for hours. That was nice.
Yeah. That was a great night, man.
If I don't see you again, I want to tell you, Dave, you're the best friend I've ever had.
You're my best friend too, man. The best friend I could have asked for.
Who would have thought, huh? The two of us. After all we've gone through, it ends like this.
We're not done yet. Alright, I'll see you on the other side, alright?
That would be nice. I hope God loves me.
How could he not?
It's so cold, Dave. I think my time is up. I'm scared. Will you hold me?
Yeah, of course.
I see the stars, Dave. They're so bright.
Robot was a toy. But to many of us, he was a friend, a lover, a husband and a father. I knew Robot his whole life, and not a day went by without us talking. We did everything together, totally inseparable. He was always there for me, you know. A shoulder to cry on, someone to talk to. Before he died, I told him that God loves him. I really hope I was right.
Very nice.
Delightful film. It was such a perfect little mix of both tragedy and comedy.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, it's like completely ridiculous, so you can't take it the tragedy too seriously.
It reminds me a lot of a short that Joel Haver did like maybe a couple years ago, the Curious George one, where it's like Curious George is with the man with the yellow hat, and he's on his deathbed, and it's like really sad. But Curious George starts talking about these conspiracy theories and stuff, which kind of throws a monkey wrench into the tragedy a little bit.
Monkey wrench.
But it reminded me a lot of that, just between the deathbed scene with the like transformer, and then he like hands him like a cigarette, and something about like seeing this transformer, this like toy, like smoking a cigarette is just really funny.
I think the part where I really lost it was the funeral, where it pans over to like the crowd
to
at the
the
funeral,
appliances, yeah,
and it's just a bunch of appliances.
Yeah, and also like something I noticed while rewatching it just now is the way it uses environment. So like the first half of the film is like in this kind of cold interior. It almost doesn't feel like there's any windows in there. And then we cut to like post-mortem. You're in like an outside setting, very lush, very green. And it almost kind of
still a backyard though.
It is still a backyard, but like
which makes it even funnier to me, honestly.
Right. It just like it toes the line between tragedy and comedy perfectly. But that juxtaposition between like cold reality interior to like lush exterior kind of conveys to me like this return to nature, this kind of return to the earth sort of theme, whether you tried to convey that or not. That's how it came across to me. Really good stuff. Really good stuff.
One thing that really got me was the lighting, especially in the first half where the robot's on his deathbed. But an aside, I love that he was calling you Dave.
Yeah,
which,
as a Space Odyssey fan,
yeah,
oh,
I was
so
like,
good.
haha, that's funny.
Yeah.
But the lighting, you've all heard you'd rather have a bad camera than a bad mic because bad sound will take you out of a film much faster than bad visuals.
Mm-hmm.
But on top of that, like in the tenets of like where you need the quality, it's usually I put like good sound and then right under it, good lighting, because the lighting really boosted the production value through the ceiling, I feel.
Yeah, and I agree. And in the like technically second shot, not technically second shot because there's a brief montage at the start of the film, but like the first kind of main shot is that shot through the doorway of the main character like talking on the phone, and then we cut to the robot. And there's like a LED strip above the bed that lights up the robot and kind of just draws your eyes to him. And if you didn't know this, the thing that's most well lit within a frame is the thing that's going to draw people's eyes the most. And so that the way information was communicated in those shots between like person on the phone and then person that he was talking about, using that lighting, I think worked really well.
This has been your lesson in cinematic grammar. Go
there
forth
you go.
and drop out of film school.
You can use lighting to tell a story. It's amazing. I love this art form.
No, this was a delightful little film.
Mm-hmm.
Is like the perfect length. It didn't overstay its welcome, and yet it was like not so short that it was just like 2 throwaway jokes and went away.
Right.
I really did like the sound design, especially down at the very end, where as you hear like the bird squawking in the background, and it like carries over to the credits. I thought it was very fun.
I really liked the underscore. I'm curious if Jack made the score himself because it felt very simple.
It said so in the credits.
Oh, okay. I missed that. I totally missed that. Yeah, big fan of making your own score. We've done that a lot for our micro shorts and
still
also
currently
actually
doing
our
it for a
film.
feature.
Yeah, sometimes all you need is something really simple because anything you'll download online is very often a little too much the focus. You know, it's overproduced. It has too many layers, and sometimes all you need is just like a simple beat, some simple underscore. Yeah, I thought it was really good.
Great film.
Well, this has been the audience participation section of the film of the film podcast. We got to come up with like a title for this section because we do hope to do it more often.
Yeah, we hope to continue to foster that community, not just make it like us two talking about the same like 5 short films we've done, and also the upcoming the upcoming feature that will eventually come out.
Again, if you'd like your film featured on the podcast, be sure to click the link in the description, fill out the form, and maybe we'll watch it and learn from it together. That's the idea here.
Well, I do believe it's time for another time-honored segment of the show.
Oh, no.
I do not have a score, or actually, Zach, if I do have a score, just play it here. Zach's Gear Corner! What do you have for us this week?
I actually don't have much this week. Because, you know, gear can be kind of, I haven't been thinking about gear as much just because I've been thinking
That's
about,
a shock.
like, I know, right? Well, it's funny because I think about gear more when I'm not working on a project. And then when I'm working on projects or multiple projects, I'm focused on, like, the things that matter more. So I'm lucky enough to already have the equipment that I need to just, like, get the job done. I mentioned, I think last week that, like, having quality gear is really important. Gear that just kind of stays out of your way. So I find that when I'm working on projects, like I'm in the middle of working on a project, I'm not thinking about the gear because the gear I have does stay out of the way, which is really good. I'm really lucky for that. But I'd like to talk about a new addition to my productivity setup, which is this iPad here. Been using it to take notes throughout the podcast. This was my wife's iPad. She didn't use it anymore because we got her an iMac, and the iMac is a superior computing device. So I'm using this iPad. The iPad is not a tool that I recommend to almost anyone. It serves almost no purpose. It doesn't solve any legitimate problem.
Parents give them to babies on the plane, and they stay
supposedly.
Quieter.
I hear, yes, iPad babies. They're running wild these days.
Rampant.
Yeah, everywhere. But I think if you have like a decent computer, I just can't believe how many young people these days don't have a computer. They just do everything on their phone. That kind of blows my mind.
It's a computer in your pocket.
It is a computer in your pocket, and it does do, you can check emails, I guess. You can file your taxes, technically.
You
What
can
else
do it
do you
through
really need?
Venmo now, I think.
Yeah. I had friends in school that would write their school essays on their phone. They didn't have a computer. And then
That takes
eventually,
some bravery.
because they
I'll
were
be
borrowing
honest.
my computer to write their essays, because that was a terrible workflow, they would just get like a Chromebook, which does serve a real purpose because it's like a cheap computer with an attached keyboard, and the
Yeah, it's
total
an
cost
iPad with an attached keyboard, basically.
right, but the total cost is like what an iPad keyboard would normally cost. You know what I mean? So it's like it's cheap, it fulfills that purpose. But the iPad is freaking weird, man. I love using it. I've been using it for like scripting episodes. I scripted this episode on it, working on other projects with it. I love the Apple Pencil, like digital but handwritten notes is like really fun. But it's kind of a luxury. It's just kind of like a I want to do computing things, but away from my computer. You know what I mean? So
Now you are the iPad baby.
yeah, literally. I don't know. It is nice to like do work in my living room, but at the same time, I do have a laptop. Like, do you see what I'm saying here?
Yeah.
It just doesn't serve like a real purpose. So my whole point in Zach's Gear Corner today is like, don't buy an iPad because it's pointless and it's a luxury. Only
But if you
buy it.
have one,
But if you have one, it can be fun. Hopefully that saves you money. I don't know.
I think if you have like a sort of on-set production environment where having one of those would be valuable. You know,
Absolutely.
I know people that programmed lights off an iPad so they could
Yeah.
run around.
All of my
Um,
lights I can control with the iPad. So I plan on doing more production related things with it, bringing it on set, having the script and stuff. And that's part of the reason why I was like, hey, do you use your iPad anymore? And my wife was like, no, like literally haven't used it in months. Do you want to do you want it? You want it to just be your iPad now? I was like, yeah, it sounds kind of dope. So it's been fun. I'm a little torn. I can't recommend it.
but we're gonna talk about it in Zach's Ear Corner.
That's all I have to talk about. What is there to talk about? I have everything I need. I'm lucky.
I think it's if you have like a tied to the desktop computer, a workstation,
Right.
that you have to sit down at a specific part of your house for, but you don't have a laptop because, to be honest, most people I know that use laptops outside of college don't bring their laptop, please. Maybe
I
to a
don't.
coffee shop.
I dock
But
my
it's like-
laptop into my
yeah.
monitor and it never moves.
I bring mine into the living room every now and then just to hook up to the TV, etc.
Right, but you have a laptop in a Mac Mini.
Yes.
So,
Now I have a Mac
that
Mini,
makes
so
sense.
I'm here. I'm in front of you right now with a Mac Mini, and that's where I'm spending most of my time.
Mhm.
But if I need something a little more portable, I'll use the laptop, even though it's a bit of a pain because it's old and the battery's dying.
Mhm.
But if I didn't have that laptop, I would be a little more amenable to getting an iPad of some sort.
Yeah, I could see that. I could definitely see that. Unfortunately for me, it's even less justifiable. Like, I mean, I have the iPad, so that's cool. But like if I didn't have it, I could probably never justify having one because it's like, well, isn't the laptop just a better iPad? Like, let's be
exactly.
real. The iPad is just a big phone.
For like an onset, or maybe if you're like a delivery driver, it's great for getting those e-signatures.
Oh yeah, yeah. No, I talked to a salesman today, like at my front door, just trying to sell me like lawn care stuff, and he had an iPad and was like putting my information, and I was like, yeah, that makes sense. Had the same insight today.
I do think it has like the film applications of whatever you need to do on the go as far as that.
Right.
Instead of a clipboard, you have an iPad. Now everything's digital. Isn't this great?
Mhm.
And you still need a clipboard anyway because some things do need to be on paper.
Mhm.
But instead of that, you can just like run on iPad. That's great.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah, for certain people, it's just like I can't recommend it. And
yeah, I don't know if I would call it
feel like
a
was worth
serious
talking about.
filmmaker's tool.
Right. No, I feel like it's worth talking about because in every Zach's Gear Corner, I'm like, this is a game-changing piece of gear. The iPhone is super portable. I'm shooting everything on it. It's the modern Bolex. It's game-changing. And I just wanted to let you know, like, not everything is game-changing. This is me playing devil's advocate on Zach's Gear Corner. And also, like, I've just been thinking about it a lot because for the past 2 days, I've been trying to get away with doing as much as possible on it. Last thing I'll say about it is it's really good for reading. Like my homepage, I just have like the news app, I have my books app, I have the Medium app, and I can just do obviously email as well. So I can sit on my couch, read some articles, do some research. Like I'm
You're not
subscribed
having
to some.
to like arch your back into a sea over a laptop to read.
Yeah. Well, this is pretty easy. Like what I've got going on here is pretty easy to read on. But just having something that's like book sized and I can take it into the living room, and then take notes. Like I can do like a multitasking thing. It's really good for research. Like if I'm trying to like research like new filmmaking things. Like I'm subscribed to like Filmmaker magazine. It's nice. But that's all I have to say about the iPad. So this has been Zack's
Dear Corner.
All right, guys. Well, to wrap up today's episode, the last thing that we're going to be doing, we're going to be taking a look at some screenshots from our recent feature film. We're going to be breaking down the compositions in them. Maybe teach you guys a little bit more about composition, maybe a little bit more about architecture. So it should be a fun time. And hopefully this will kind of help ground some of these concepts that we've been talking about. So what do you say, Matteo?
Yeah.
Okay, so we'll start with this one. So this is one of the opening scenes. It's not technically the opening scene. This film has kind of multiple intros. There's
You're welcome.
Yes,
I did that.
thanks,
That's
Matteo.
my fault.
The A plot and the B plot kind of starts at the same time. So this is the B plot intro. But yeah, kind of walk me through what's going on in the shot, Matteo.
Not much because it's all foggy and smoky and you
Yeah.
can't tell. But it gives us that. And like last week we had that fridge shot where like we're not sure what we're looking at, and then the robot and Does God Love Robots opens up the fridge, and we're like, that's what's going on, and it's that like that push and pull of tension and payoff. And here we have the tension where we can clearly see like down below, like kind of the edge of a gun, and then we see these sort of gas mask like figures, but it's so like in shadow. And this I've talked about it before, but my personal view of the like composition is that the eye is a muscle too. So you are with your eye basically feeling the movement as you get attracted from like the very light kind of splash of white in the center, and then you get pulled to like the more subtle like reflections on the visors of the gas masks
Right.
out towards the right.
And obviously we're only looking at a screenshot here, but the actual shot, has progression. And the intro, or like the beginning of this shot, you only see like the reflection of their eyes through the visors kind of coming out through the darkness. And then as the camera tracks backwards, we see the smoke and we start to see the silhouette and stuff more. And so I'm really glad you brought up that like that tension of, what are we looking at? Oh, it's this, but like, what is it? But, oh, okay, cool. Like that back and forth is literally that plays out throughout this entire shot.
An additional tension here is the white, specifically on like the left edge of this shot. There's already a leading line with the barrel of that gun in the corner of the frame that draws you up towards the white. But it's so crowded towards the side of that shot that it provides a weird tension with all the black space on the left.
And because the character on the left is looking into the left of the frame while also being like relatively close up against it, that's what we call short sighting. And so if you want to create like a sense of tension and claustrophobia, just have someone looking into the side of the frame that they're closest to. And again, that's called short sighting, and that's something that we're sort of implementing in this shot as well.
If you look at a lot of like paintings that have energy to them, you'll see a lot of the same, either short sighting or just something cut off at the edge of the frame. It makes it feel crowded despite being a wide frame in this case.
Right.
Though I do believe we're cutting to 4x5.
Yes. So it is worth
4 by
mentioning
3.
the film will be 4x3. These are just like kind of the full resolution screenshots, but that shouldn't affect too much. This one's got some visual tension.
It's centered, and yet look at the again on the left of that frame. It's cut off. It's providing energy.
I want to point out the environment in this shot. We talked a lot about environments and how they can elicit certain moods. Here we have like the plastic wrap throughout the scene, which kind of conveys this clinical kind of feeling. Like these characters are in a clinical environment. They're doing a very clinical operation, and obviously it's gone terribly wrong, as you can see.
And yeah, it's almost like a cathedral where you have these, or like a theater where you have these big drapes, except it's plastic sheeting. It provides a sense of vignette to it almost.
Yeah.
Rather than just like a couch in a white apartment, which you've seen a billion of.
Yeah. And fun fact, this couch is the couch that we started the podcast on.
Yeah. That beloved green couch.
I want to point out the symmetry in this shot. What do you feel like the symmetry does for you, Matteo?
It focuses our eyes right on our actor Colton in the middle. And it seems to really, with the two people on the side, one of those is me, take a guess which one. With the two people on the side, sprawled out, they kind of forms a V, and then if you see, there's also a triangle up from up from their chins, basically, up through the splashes of blood on the wall that really puts him in the center, almost hems him in.
For me, symmetry and beauty are kind of interlinked. And I think there's a really interesting juxtaposition between the symmetry in this shot and then also the fact that like something terribly has gone wrong in it. That beauty through the symmetry juxtaposed with that, I think is really interesting. And so even though there's not like a question being asked in the shot, I think that creates the tension that the shot needs to be interesting.
There's that same symmetry again,
right?
This time much more pronounced.
Yeah, and we mentioned how like you can create different feelings through using the same technique but just using it in different ways. And so in this shot we're creating a sense of like tension and claustrophobia by framing you, the main character, in between these two people who are at this club dancing. Whereas like kind of in the first shot of the film that we looked at with the operators in the woods, we created that through the negative fill, the negative space, but it was a similar wide shot.
Another bit, and obviously I was on that side of the camera because that's me, but you can see the way the fingers almost match up with the railing, and to bring in this almost prison bar feel to it. A lot of people will do this with a sort of like the window shade fill onto somebody, so it's like, I'm projecting the prison bars onto them. But this is done with the actual fingers, which it's a really good shot. I'm a big fan of it.
I really like the shot. This is, I think, my favorite shot in the movie. It might not immediately jump out to you as being like all that impressive, but I just personally think there's so much depth in this shot. Just between the layers of light and shadow, the way that we used the gobo and the projector light to project those blinds onto your character, and the way that like part of you is illuminated by it and part of you is not. We have depth because we have the TV on, and then we have like shadow and darkness on either side of it. We have a light. We have a chair to the left, a white chair that's like peeking into the frame. We also have the white vent that's on the door to the right, kind of right middle of the frame. These layers of light and shadow show themselves in multiple ways, and I think that creates a lot of depth. And then also the way the leading lines between the wires that kind of go off to the left and the up top portion of the frame, and then they connect to you and all the peripherals around you. This shot just has so much visual cohesion while also looking really messy, and I'm a big fan of it.
Yeah, it's really strong. It almost reminds me of like a Renaissance battle scene in many ways. I do want to point out how there's a symmetry as whenever I was in art classes, they were talking about like the twin trees, where if you see like two trees in a classical painting, there's often like another two trees like balancing out somewhere in the frame. And here you can see it with the back of the chair and the CRT TV, and then the light on the shirt and then the vent. They both have they're doing that balancing act. Meanwhile, the pants and the darkness of the other CRT kind of out in the back balance each other as well. And then you also see the triangular focal point of this corner up here in between the CRT and the vent. That line is drawn with actually the edge of the TV and then the desk, and then it gets drawn through the vent and the CRT to the right as well.
Yeah, so not even like there's leading lines all over the shot, and I just think I'm really proud of it.
It's a good one. I was astounded when I saw it. Also to hem in the character that I'm playing here, you also have all the books kind of arranged in a circle, almost like a crib in which I'm sleeping.
This shot.
Here we are focusing again.
Yeah. So I mentioned in the in Jack's film that we watched a little bit ago how light can kind of draw your eyes to certain parts of the frame, and I think this shot represents that idea more than almost any other shot. Clear spotlight on you. I think you would be the focus of the shot regardless, but here, I mean, there's a specific feling that we're obviously trying to get across here.
It's downright Lynchian. He loves his spotlights. A couple things here. I wanna note how the shadow on the pants and the headboard sort of mirror each other. Which really kind of squishes your focus not on just all of me, but on that specific spotlighted portion of me in the film.
I can see that.
While the light, actually the desk light and the light on me mirror each other to balance the frame in a way that the door and the painting above it balance with the rectangular lines.
Yeah. One thing I like about it is that this shot has a lot of symmetry and it has a lot of balance because it's like framed as like a center shot. Subject is in the middle. But if you notice to the left, we have this dark doorway, and on the right, we have this like lamp that's lighting up the wall. And, your outstretched hands in combination with that framing choice, it kind of gives the impression that you're trying to make a choice here. There's two different paths that you could go down. And so in the film, this happens after, some pivotal moments, and the character is thinking about which path to take next. Does he want to go towards what he knows is good for him, or does he want to go down this self-destructive path? And I feel like this shot communicates that what's going on in his brain perfectly.
I do want to say this also has a lot of good left to right energy in it, as from the bottom corner of the frame up to the corner of the bed frame, you see there's just this like really like stark line that moves you from left to right throughout it.
Right. Not to mention that the bed serves as leading lines to the character.
Mm-hmm. It's really well done. This shot was more or less done on a whim. We had the general idea, but this was the more sort of let's get crazy with it, let's get artistic with it, and throw it away if it doesn't work.
Yeah, we were going to do something a bit more basic. We were just going to film you getting into bed, but this was like an on-set decision that I think was a really good one. Okay, moving on to our last shot for today. It's a powerful shot. What does this shot bring to mind, Matteo?
The ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, where Adam reaches out to touch God's hand.
Yeah, there's a lot of like iconography in this film. The previous shot with like kind of the outstretched hands was one of them, and then this one of like the Adam and God like almost touching but not quite. This is supposed to elicit a similar feeling. I don't want to spend too much time on this one because we might get too close.
Spoilers
into spoiler territory, but I think it's abstract enough to be worth bringing up. And I also just think it's a beautiful shot. I want to point out the backlight. So I think that if you're trying to decide how to light a scene, always default to just having a backlight. Either use the backlight as your key light in film, or just make sure that you have one in the first place, because having a backlight it creates so much depth, so much visual separation, and it just looks beautiful. Also, you can get lucky and get these really beautiful lens flares like the one that we have here. The lens I used for this is the Nikon AIS 20mm lens.
Where was this in Zack's corner?
I know. Okay, next week we're talking about the lenses used to make Hypnagogia.
Right, I'll hold you to that.
Also, because we got to ride the hype train leading up to the release. Of course,
yeah.
But this lens flares very beautifully, and this, oh gosh, the center of the flare and the center of everything comes together.
The way the pistol is kind of highlighted by it, and yet obscured.
Mm-hmm. This is a fun scene. I don't think you've seen this scene edited yet, but it's very intense and very fun. Well, I think that concludes us looking at screenshots from our feature film. Hopefully you guys learned a little bit about composition. I know we've kind of talked about it in a more, kind of loose terms, but also I hope that these examples kind of bring it home in a more applicable way.
Again, there's a lot of people out there who can tell you the rules, and there's a lot of people out there who will tell you to break the rules, and sometimes they're wrong. But here's a few little practical applications and how we broke some rules. Again, thank you for coming along with me on this journey.
As always. And thank you to our audience as well.
Yeah, thank you to our audience. Shout out to Jack McPherson for that wonderful little film, Powering Down. Again, like, I love seeing other people's work and how they institute the language of film completely different than what I do and completely different than what Zack does. As, like, everybody has their own little artistic quirks and their own artistic methods for which they deploy that same cinematic grammar.
Right. And it's really helpful to see different people approaching things that, like, subject matter that we've approached before, but like in a completely different way. I think that this is a really fun opportunity for us to all learn from each other and watch some cool films as part of that intake cycle.
If you want to join in on the conversation, please click that link, submit it. We'd love to see more, and maybe we'll throw it on the show.
I've been your host, Zachary Koch.
I've been your host, Matteo Guthrie.
And you should go make a movie.
Go make one right now. This has been Your Next Film. Bye.
Peace out.
Ciao, ciao.